Hello and welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces.Dreams. Today on our channel, we want to talk about China, its economic policies, and how that relates to inequality. And to talk about these things, who better to ask than Dr. Isabella Weber? Isabella is assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and she's a political economist of China and global trade. Isabella wrote a book recently, which is about to come out after the summer, called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. And we want to know from her what shock therapy is, how China escaped it, and what that all has to do with the subject that interests us here on our channel, Inequalities. Welcome to the program, Isabella.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, we're very happy to have you here and tell us a lot more about your special area, China, and how it figures in the world and what it has to do with inequality. And I would like to start with your new book that is about to be out, and that is called How China Escaped the Shock Therapy. Could you tell us something about what the shock therapy actually is, and then how China managed to escape it?
Sure. Thanks so much for bringing this up. Shock therapy is basically a policy paradigm that became gradually dominant in the 1980s that had at its core the idea that in order to reform an economy or to recreate the economy, you needed to tear down all the institutions of direct state control that were in place before, such as price controls, but also direct state ownership. In the vision of the shock therapists, the most important and first step towards shock therapy was to get rid of all price controls, since it was acknowledged that privatizing, restructuring ownership would be a relatively slow process. Even if one wanted to do it as aggressively as possible, it would take time to work it out. However, to let go of prices was thought to be possible to be done fairly quickly. So you could cut price controls overnight. So therefore, the idea was that the really shocking element of shock therapy, the initial big bang towards the recreation of the economic system in one big blow, would be the liberalization of prices. Now, China basically in the late 1970s was at a point where Mao had died in 1976. Mao's designated heir, Hua Guofeng, had tried another attempt at Soviet-style big push industrialization, that is emphasizing heavy industry development, emphasizing a state-led big agenda towards development. That pretty much failed, partially because it was thought that it could rely on foreign technology and that this foreign technology should be financed with oil exports. However, this oil was never found. So this strategy kind of ran out of steam. So by the late 1970s, Hua Guofeng gradually had lost power and Deng Xiaoping kind of stepped on the stage. So Deng Xiaoping then is confronted with the question of how to rebuild China's economy when this last attempt at Stalinist-style big push industrialization had failed. The Cultural Revolution was by then long over and was also considered a huge political failure. So the question was really what now and what to do now. It was clear that China was still a very poor country. China had, of course, achieved certain basic industrialization, important breakthroughs in public health and so on, but it was still a very poor country. And in this context, the idea of escaping backwardness and the idea of putting economic development first and making this the overall priority for the communist state became the hegemonic paradigm. But wanting development and achieving development are, of course, two very different things, as we as people who have worked on development economics know very well. It was also clear fairly early on that China's development should involve more market. So there was an acknowledgement that basically the attempt to industrialize through planning had hit its limits and that more market mechanism, more market dynamism was needed. So in that sense, China was very much part of this global movement towards more market. However, the big question was how to introduce markets into a basically state-planned economy, right? And in this context, there were, to put it very simply, basically two very broad brush options. One was what has later come to be called shock therapy. That is basically the idea that the planning institutions, in particular price controls, would have to be torn down in order to make space for market mechanisms and to make space for the free movement of prices, which would then help to rationalize the economy, make it more efficient, and kind of bring it back on track. The alternative that was gradually emerging, not so much out of a big theoretical idea, as was the case for shock therapy, but rather out of gradual experimentation, trying to work out how one could introduce market mechanisms, was to, instead of destroying the planning institutions, using them as market creators and opening up space for markets at the margins of the existing system, and thereby creating this interaction between planning institutions and market mechanisms that then eventually evolved into this hybrid system, really, that we are observing in China today. Of course, there's not a straight line from the 1980s to the year 2021, but nevertheless, I think that this history is important in trying to understand that China's economy today is based on a very different kind of state-market relations compared to the one that we observe, say, in Europe or the US.
In hindsight, of course, it's quite easy to say we have these two options and shock therapy terribly failed. I mean, we can see, for example, the case of the crumbling of the former Soviet Union and the post-Union Russia, etc. And then we have this bright example of China. At the moment, however, it was probably a lot more difficult to make this decision and to anticipate. And it was, I assume, a lot of trial and error and as you say, testing out strategies. What was the ideology behind, if there's a lack of a theory behind or of actual knowledge from prior examples, let's say, how did they make these decisions, or how did they, in China, policymakers decide that this was the way to go forward?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that by the late 1970s, when reforms started in China, it was by no means a foregone conclusion that China was on the rise, right? I mean, the Chinese Revolution was in 1949, as probably most people know. By 1980, China's share in world GDP was still roughly on a similar level as it had been in 1949. Some were just below 5%. There's all sorts of discussions around what precisely it was. But in terms of the magnitude, it was still very small. China was still very poor. China was, in fact, by the late 80s, still looking up to the Brazilian development miracle as a shining example. So in that sense, we have to remember that this was neither the model nor the trajectory of this unprecedented economic expansion was a foregone conclusion. So how did they come up with this kind of alternative to shock therapy? Or why did they abstain from shock therapy when at that time it wasn't at all clear what precisely the consequences of this would be? In terms of how did they come up with this alternative model, I think the importance of the agricultural reforms cannot be overstated. Basically, the Maoist economy was very much a dual economy where the urban industrial economy was organized, looking at it from a general perspective, was organized based on the idea of the economy functioning as one big national workshop where each production unit would be basically receiving price and output orders from a higher up planning institution and was then handing down their outputs to the next production unit that would be paying a price for it, but the price that is being paid for this output was not what would have determined the production decisions. Instead, the production decisions were primarily, at least in an ideal word, guided by the commands that were received. In contrast, in the agricultural economy, you had, of course, the people's communes, and the people's communes were linked to the urban industrial system via basically an exchange of grain, in particular grain, but also other agricultural outputs, quotas that would be produced by the communes, delivered to the respective authorities in charge, and for which in turn the communes would get a price, which determined, very generally speaking, the kind of budget that they would then have in order to buy industrial goods that they needed for their own agricultural projects. Now, this price had always been set in a fashion that was to the disadvantage of the agricultural sphere. So this was the so-called price scissors, where basically peasants would have to work more hours to get the same amount of value or consumption bundles, or however you want to measure that, compared to their urban counterparts. Or in other words, there would have been a net transfer from the agricultural sphere to the urban industrial sphere. In the beginning of the reforms, this price scissors has to some extent been adjusted. So there's not completely, but it has been the big disadvantage for the countryside has been narrowed down to some extent. Almost more importantly, whereas previously the higher levels of organization within the people's communes would have been responsible for delivering their output that would then be handed over to the urban industry system in terms of quotas. Now, what happened in the early days of reform is that experiments were springing up that basically hark back to earlier experiences in the Maoist period, pretty much after the Great Leap Forward, in which the responsibility for output was moved from these higher up organizational units within the people's communes to the households. So basically, households now could say, as long as we deliver our share in the quota, beyond that, we can do whatever we want, instead of being members of the work team and having to spend all their time as laborers in the work team. They now became responsible for their own production, became responsible for their share of the quota, but also had the possibility to produce sideline products, to produce things beyond the quota, which could then be brought to the market. Now, that meant that basically this basic link between the urban industrial system and the countryside still existed. There was still the same or similar size of quota that was being handed over to the urban industrial system against the price that was paid in return. But the organizational structure of the agricultural production completely changed. And with it, a so-called dual track or a multi-track price system emerged, where the share that of agricultural outputs that will be produced by these households, not for the quota, but for markets that started to spring up, and that often also were organized by state commercial agencies, were at different prices, at basically some kind of market prices. Okay. So you had this logic of a dual track system where, at least on the surface, the old system continued to work in terms of the relationship between the urban industrial core and agricultural production. But under the surface, markets were starting to become incredibly important, and started to induce these rural producers to produce more than they would have been producing before. Now, this basic logic of maintaining the quota, but allowing the production units to go beyond the quota, was basically then transferred into the urban industrial sphere, which makes some sense if you think about it, because if the agricultural producers start to produce more and they also start to go into light industries, like these township and village enterprises are popping up, then of course they also need industrial inputs, right? But they are not part of the national workshop. So they create, there is a demand for stuff that goes beyond what was happening under the old system, right? So kind of endogenously, you get this dynamic, which is initially kind of in a gray area and like semi-legal, or like kind of turned a blind eye to let it happen type of thing, where production units start to also produce for the market. So they continue to deliver their quota at the state set price. The core of the urban industrial system continues, but at the margins, they gradually are being allowed to produce also for the market. So you get this kind of dual track system, which then is really the starting point for this, what we call gradualist, experimentalist Chinese reform approach. Now, if you think about it, if you have enterprises that are producing for the plan and are producing for the market at the same time, of course, this creates a lot of friction, right? And it creates a lot of possibilities for corruption, because the officials that are in charge that have access to the often considerably cheaper inputs under the plan have, of course, large incentives to somehow divert these resources and work into their own pockets. In the early days of reform, this wasn't as pervasive yet, but as the reforms progressed and the market logic kind of was starting to become dominant, also in the ways in which people thought about their own economic activities, this became a pervasive problem. So this friction and this problem of corruption that did emerge out of the dual track system became basically the main weakness and the main point of attack for the shock therapists, who were saying, well, this messy, messed up dual system that we have now is actually worse than what we had before. Since before, we had a clean-cut plan system that wasn't great, but at least it made some sense. Now we have this like monster of all sorts of different mechanisms happening at the same time, right? So it would be better to cut especially the price links and the links of commands over outputs against certain state set prices in one fell of the knife, in one fell swoop of the knife, in order to kind of create a clean plate. And then from that, one could create a functioning market economy.
And were they right to say that?
Well, that's a big question, right? At the time, it seemed like a possibly attractive option in the sense that both, in fact, the Eastern European reform economists who were looking back to quite a substantial amount of time of failed reforms by that point, by the mid-1980s, as well as neoclassical economists from the West, would be arguing that having clear price signals is the most important thing for a functioning economy. So from that angle, having this multi-tier mixed up price system seemed like the worst possible option. And since this was kind of the Western fashionable, cutting edge, most scientific kind of way of thinking about economics, there was, of course, a strong cloud building up around this. This also involved organizations like the World Bank that helped to organize exchanges with foreign experts. Notice that, of course, the situation was different compared to many other developing countries where, for example, price liberalization could be part of a conditionality for loans, right? This was not the case in China. This was, the World Bank did provide some loans, but it was much more important as an institution that organized economic expertise. So this idea was becoming very fashionable. And as the problems with the dual track were mounting, this idea was starting to become more and more attractive. If you can have such a clear-cut overnight solution, why mess around and try to muddle your way through, right? Was basically the kind of arguments for the shock therapy side of things. However, was a group of economists that very much emerged from the agricultural reforms that had been so-called sent down youth during the Cultural Revolution. So they had spent their heyday of their youth in the countryside, in the people's communes as sent down youth, and then returned to the cities when Deng Xiaoping restarted the university entrance exams. And this kind of movement of reform, young reform intellectuals emerged in that context, in the early period of reform. And since they had these ties back with the countryside and they were deeply invested in the question of agricultural development, and they often had family or acquaintances with people very high up in the leadership, they kind of became independent, of course, not completely independent, but like a third party type of research entity that was not from within the official hierarchies of academies of social sciences and the official institutions of research that were very much part of the state itself. They were like this kind of gray area emerging unit of researchers. And they had helped to the breakthrough in agricultural reforms by researching experiments that were popping up in the countryside. And since the agricultural reform was the big breakthrough for reform overall, China for the first time had basically a situation of grain surpluses, which hadn't happened in a very long time, right? And which of course gave space for development more generally. So they had a direct link with, in particular, Zhao Ziyang, but also other top leaders. Zhao Ziyang was a premier at the time. And as reform progressed, they were also a key force that helped to theorize this dual track system as a not only something that is emerging spontaneously, but as something that could present a coherent form of reform approach. Now, when in 1986, China actually came very close to implementing overall price liberalization, they had a whole program set up, like top economists were working on it. They already had the schedule. They were ready to combine price liberalization with wage reforms, tax reform, and severe austerity, where the idea was that as long as you impose sufficient macroeconomic control, tight fiscal and monetary policy, this price liberalization would not result in inflation and instead would produce these desired rational prices. Now, this other group of researchers that I've described basically hold against this idea that because under the old system, key industrial inputs such as steel, coal, copper, and so on, I mean, basic raw materials that you basically need for any kind of industrial production, were priced consciously below cost, whereas more non-essential goods, more consumer goods were consciously priced above cost, which was basically a mechanism of redistribution across sectors. Now, they argued if you would liberalize the prices in the heavy industries and the core industrial inputs, these prices will be shooting up because they are below cost. So if you now make them free, then they will shoot up. And in fact, the dual track system indicated that the planned prices were way too low because the market prices were up in the sky, which was part of the problem of the dual track system, right? Which was part of what created this impetus for inflation. But nevertheless, they argued like just liberalizing them wouldn't solve the problem because what you would get would be cost push inflation. Since if the price for steel goes through the roof, then the price for bicycles will go through the roof, the price for wristwatches will go through the roof, the price for radios will go through the roof. If the prices of all these, by then fairly important consumption goods, were escalating in such a fashion, workers would start to demand higher wages. Since these were still socialist production units, it would be very hard to suppress such wage demands. So as a result, what you would get from this liberalization would be a wage price spiral and basically a spiraling out of inflation rather than some sort of rationalization of the price vector. So the basic idea was that by simply liberalizing prices, one would not create a functioning market economy. Rather, one would create an even bigger mess than the mess that was already emerging under the dual track system. And in 1986, this was basically, these kinds of arguments were critical in preventing this program from being implemented. Ironically, this also involved research that has been done in Hungary and Yugoslavia, where previously not exactly shock therapy, but very major price reforms had been attempted and had basically been reported to these Chinese delegations by the respective Hungarian officials and people who were in charge of economic work as failure. And they were basically warning against the possibility of inflation from these kind of reform approaches. So in 86, then Zhao Ziyang basically withdraws from this plan. In 88, this plan comes back up on the agenda. And at that point, Deng Xiaoping himself, so the grand leader of reform, basically is the one who pushes for this kind of reform. And the political dynamic plays out in a way that he cannot be prevented from pursuing this. And there's an announcement that there will be major price reform. And people who by then already realized that marketization is not just win-win, but that marketization also comes at very severe costs. It was the first time, I'm talking about inequality, it was the first time that certain income groups were actually no longer rapidly increasing their income, as had been the case in earlier periods of the reform. So people are already nervous about okay, this has been exciting, but now this is becoming a bit too hot. And in particular, the urban working class was realizing that this could eventually touch upon their so-called iron rice ball, their welfare provisions, their ensured livelihoods that the old system was presenting. So when Deng Xiaoping announces this big price reform, which we retrospectively can think of as the first step in shock therapy, the reaction is that people start to panic, and there's panic buying of any kind of durable goods, there's bank runs and so on. So that as a result of this rush to buy, in an already somewhat lightly inflationary environment, the prices for the first time since the revolution really kind of get out of control. And in response to that, this attempt is stalled, and it's a complete reversal happens, which is an important background for what then happens in 89 and the protests on Tiananmen Square and the brutal crackdown and the fall of Zhao Ziyang, who was premier throughout the 80s and who was really one of the key architects of China's market reforms.
It's clear that there is a very close relationship between politics and economics at this level, right? And especially when the one party has such a big influence. And I'd like to ask something a little bit related, but on a more international level there. These political choices, of course, have their counterpart in the rest of the world that probably has, or some areas that have a specific interest in this liberalization, right? And you mentioned there some economists and some World Bank employees, etc. But there's of course a more general global context of anti-communism and even other resentments. But do you think there's also a dimension of international trade relations involved there? That there is an interest in this liberalization because there is some other advantage for the rest of the world? Slightly leading question, maybe, but you're welcome to take it in the other direction.
Well, of course, there is great interest in China's liberalization. And I don't think we need to be conspiracy theorists and say this has been somehow manufactured from abroad. But from the perspective of Chinese economists who would be involved in these debates and who would have had a trajectory where they might have been established intellectuals, and then during the Cultural Revolution, they have been ousted and have been sent to the countryside, deprived of their positions, and degraded to literally looking after pigs, right? And then they return to Beijing, they return to academia, they return to research, and they return to this position of influence. And they start to be taken seriously to some degree by these fancy people who come in from the West, right? I think one has to see that this is, for example, this World Bank conference that happened in the mid-80s, the so-called Barshan-Lund conference that has also aroused some recent attention, was happening on a tourist ship on the Yangtze River with a pool, with all the fancy quote-unquote luxury provisions that by then would have been prepared for Western tourists. And there would be Nobel Prize winning economists like James Tobin, who, by the way, was relatively cautious, but also people like Ottmar Emminger, the previous president of Bundesbank, and so on. So, I mean, fancy people from the West, right? Fancy people with bow ties and all of that. So I think one has to appreciate that. I mean, not to say that all of these people were corrupted, but from the individual perspective of the experience of these reform economists, this must have been very impressive and also to some extent humbling. And the weight that comes with this scientific aura of people who have a Nobel Prize, right, certainly is not to be underestimated. In terms of trade, it's really only the special economic zones start already in the late 70s, but it's only towards the late 1980s that China shifts starts to perceive the so-called coastal development strategy, where the idea is that basically the Asian tigers have shown that one can develop by having a cheap, disciplined workforce and using that workforce in labor-intensive light industry sectors, and that this could be a way to generate foreign reserves, which then could help the industrialization project more largely without running into the kind of balance of payment issues that had emerged were on the horizon in the 70s when China tried to basically import foreign technology and export basically oil. So the idea was like, okay, why can't we export our cheap labor? If we export our cheap labor and we can thereby link into the global trade system and generate an export surplus, then from that surplus, we would have funds that we can use to buy technology, to finance the upgrading of our industries, right? To kind of create a virtuous cycle of development through such an export-led strategy. Now, that, of course, was very consciously part of the development strategy, but it, of course, also presented an attractive opportunity to international enterprises, right? As wages in the Asian tigers started to rise, they were also on the lookout for alternatives, in some sense similar to what's happening now between China and Southeast Asia again. So clearly there were powerful interests also among businesses that saw a big opportunity there, right? So that is certainly the case. I think that there has also been a pretty widespread and long-lasting belief that China's marketization would eventually imply wholesale westernization and would eventually lead to an assimilation of the Chinese system politically and economically to the European and American model, which I think in parts has to do with the ways in which we think about markets. We think about markets in a very homogenic way, where it's like, well, a market is somehow the free movement of prices and private property, and that's it, right? Or the state regulates the market, but the state and the market are somehow separate entities. So this rather monolithic way of thinking about markets, I think, is on a broad theoretical level what underpins this, what I think by now is fairly clear has been a misconception that marketization would eventually amount to wholesale westernization. I'm not saying that China hasn't westernized in the last decades. I mean, clearly, culturally, economically, and so on, there has been a massive influence, in particular of the United States, on what's happening in China. But it's really the core of the system that has changed, but that has not been overhauled. And I think that this is kind of the tension that now in 2021, it's very hard to oversee. And that also, by the way, in the pandemic, in terms of how countries have reacted to the pandemic, I think became once more very clear. We're looking at this just as an economist. Under the lockdown, China has been able to mobilize private markets in ways that we have not really seen elsewhere, which I think has to do with a very specific institutional arrangement between state-owned entities and private entities and how they interact in the Chinese context.
And there's, of course, so much more interesting things to talk about, especially when we come now to our current age. But unfortunately, we're coming to a close here. We'll have a follow-up on what's happening in China today. But before we close, I'd like to ask you, Isabella, how did you become interested in this subject in the first place? I mean, I know you grew up on the borderline between one system and the other, close to the Iron Curtain. Is that what motivated you to look into these things, or what made you think that this was an important thing to know for you and everybody else?
It's really two sources of motivation. So one is when I studied economics as an undergraduate, first in Berlin and then later in Beijing, I was struck by the fact that in Beijing we were using the identical American economic textbooks that we have been studying in Berlin. And it just seemed so odd because the economic policy, I mean, I didn't understand much at the time, but it was clear that the economic policy and the whole system was working in a very different way from what I was used to in Germany. So why why would they be studying the exact same kind of economics while running their system in such a different fashion? So that kind of got me interested in the role of economics in China's context. And then after graduation, I briefly worked in Berlin, actually for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And there, of course, I had many colleagues who used to work in the GDR and who used to be diplomats and officials in some cases in the GDR. And there was in particular this, and I'm not saying here, since this is public, I'm not saying that this is what characterizes the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation as such. But for me, as someone from West Germany, that was an important experience. And there was this one moment, I mean, the Chinese counterparts were always very interested in understanding the reunification, understanding the collapse of state socialism in East Germany. And there was an occasion where there was an exchange between the last communist premier of the German Democratic Republic, Hans Modrow, and a delegation from China. And I was sitting there as a young project manager, and this question of why is Hans Modrow today someone whom I wouldn't recognize in the street? And why did history come that way in East Germany and came so differently in China? Kind of has been with me ever since. So in this project for the book, I'm kind of bringing together this question of what is the role of economics in China and the question of why did China escape shock therapy and therefore history took such a different turn. This is really what I'm then pursuing in this book.
It's a fantastic question and it's a fantastic book, and you should run and pre-order it. How China Escaped the Shock Therapy by Isabella Weber. Isabella, thank you so much for explaining all these fantastic, different, exotic connections, exotic for somebody living in a context like Mexico. If you want to learn more about it, please read the book and join us again for another episode next week by Future Frame TV. I'm your host, Alice Krozer, for the Inequalities channel, presented by Traces.Dreams. Thank you all for watching, and we'll hope you join us again next time.
Thank you so much for having me.